Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Bud Riss. I'm a member of the board of Boston Harbor Now. I also chair the organization's Policy and Planning Committee. I'm your host this morning, along with Alice and others from Boston Harbor Now who are with us. I'm very excited because I'm age 72 and the governor announced yesterday 65 and over will get the vaccine in a few weeks. So I'm celebrating. This is our first Harbor Use Public Forum of 2021, our ninth on Zoom. It looks like we'll be doing at least a few more this year, but hopefully at some point we might be able to gather together, although I think we found Zoom works pretty well for this particular forum and actually attracts a good number of folks. We're using some digital tools today that will hopefully make it feel a little bit more like an in-person meeting. And if you choose to turn on your camera and everyone can see who's in attendance, that's always great, but you of course can just display your name if you'd like. If this is your first time joining one of our harbor use public forums, or if you're not familiar with Boston Harbor Now, we're a nonprofit that's focused on ensuring that the waterfront and the harbor islands are both climate resilient, accessible, and welcoming to everyone. We work on expanded ferry service, bringing undeserved communities out to experience the harbor islands. We have a long history of support for Boston's working port, and we regularly review waterfront development projects to ensure they are both resilient and promote public access and provide great public amenities. Several members of the Boston Harbor Now staff are here today. You've already met Alice, who you heard from earlier. We're joined by Kathy Abbott, the president and CEO, and Aaron Toffler, the director of policy. Boston Harbor Now convenes these forums on a monthly basis to hear from developers, public agencies, and other advocates about work taking place around the harbor. We believe strongly that the waterfront belongs to all of us, and that by bringing together interactive conversations like this, we can help ensure better, more thoughtful, and dynamic projects. In December, we hosted the team from Accordia Partners, some of whom are with us on the meeting today, to learn about their proposed development on Columbia Point called Dorchester Bay City. This one development is only a tiny fraction of the long coastline of the Dorchester neighborhood, which was the most recent focus of the city's resilience planning efforts. Joining us today to talk about that plan is Sanjay Seth, the Climate Resilience Program Manager for Boston's Environment Department. He'll be presenting Coastal Resilience Solutions for Dorchester, which was just released in October 2010. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sanjay. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Bud, and thanks to the whole team at Boston Harbor Now for inviting us to come share some of this work, which you were also an important partner and part of. Let me just get set up here with some screen sharing. All right. You get to see, thankfully I don't have a lot of tabs open right now because it's still the morning. Great. So as Bud said, we'll be sharing a little bit about the Climate Ready Dorchester work which was released last year. First, hi, I'm Sanjay Seth. New face around here. I'm the Climate Resilience Program Manager for the City of Boston. I manage the city's adaptation and resilience programs, including the Climate Ready Boston program, for which we work in collaboration with our colleagues at the BPDA and with other partners across the public, private, and civic sector, including Boston Harbor Now. I started in this role last year and have really enjoyed getting a chance to meet many of the folks on the call today. Prior to this role, I worked on a part of the Big U in New York, also known as Lower Manhattan Coast Resiliency. And I'm very glad to return to Boston to help serve and protect the city from the impacts of climate change alongside many colleagues and partners, both in and outside of the city. Before we get started today, I just want to thank all of you who have participated in some way in the city's planning process. There's been many and there have been many meetings. And so thank you for being a part of that and being a part of this continuing work. For today's agenda, I've been asked to give a very in-depth presentation on coastal resilience solutions for Dorchester. But before doing that, it'd be really helpful to figure out who's in the room. So we'll just do some quick polls on Slido, which we'll do right after this slide. Then we'll have time to dig into the report, each individual kind of risk zone in a lot of detail. Alice has kindly volunteered to monitor our Q&A on Slido, which is accessible at slido.com with the code 7440. And Alice has license to pause the presentation at points where it feels right to bring in some questions. The benefit of using this app is also that you can upvote questions. So if you see things that you really want to have answered, it's also helpful to just upvote the questions that you want in addition to adding your own. Any remaining time after the presentation we'll use for Q&A today. But of course, I'm always accessible by email at sanjay.sait@boston.gov. And my email will show up on another slide in a little bit. But yes, let's jump into Slido and we'll see how this goes. Okay, so first, getting a sense of who's in the room. You can go to slido.com and put in the code 7440 and let me know how you're connected to Climate Ready Dorchester. I know some of you worked on it. Great. Seeing some responses come in. And you can select more than one option if you'd like. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of wonks on the call. We have a lot of folks who do this for their job, which is great. So that means getting into detail in this presentation will be beneficial. We have mostly Bostonians in the call. We have folks who are participating in, about a third of us are participating in community organizations focused on climate change adaptation. Actually, about 1 in 5 of us participated on this plan itself. So some of this might feel redundant to those folks, but thank you for being on the call. And actually not a ton of people who live or work in Dorchester. So I'll make sure to cover a little bit of the context in some greater detail, but this is helpful.
If you haven't had a chance to get onto Slido yet, you can use your phone's camera to use the QR code. That's a shortcut for people. So you can go to the website or use the QR code.
Great. Thanks, Alice. Yeah, we had about 19 respondents on that one. And you get another shot at it. So now, help us understand your familiarity with climate change adaptation. So where are you at right now in your kind of level of understanding? All right, great. We're at about 21 responses. So it looks like about 2 out of every 5 of us would feel comfortable explaining sea level rise in Boston over time, which is great. About a third of us feel comfortable with wonky things like flood exceedance probabilities, which is fancy ways of saying you have 1 in 100 chance of something happening or being exceeded. About 1 in 5 of us is an expert in the field. So great, I expect all sorts of interesting questions. Some of us are also at the early learning stages about it, which is great. And I'm glad you're on the call. And if anything is unclear at any point, make sure to put it in the chat or in Slido, and we'll take pauses to clarify as we go. But thank you all for sharing that. That's really helpful in thinking about how we do this. The last prompt before we actually dig into the presentation, and this should be interesting, in one word. So it's best if you use one word, just the way this kind of stuff displays. How would you describe Boston's approach to climate change resilience and adaptation? We'll give it just another second. All right, so it looks like we have some solid climate hawks on this call who want to see more action quicker, which I love. That is the right vibe to be in right now. We see folks saying proactive, bold, good, comprehensive, measured, decent, slow in very large letters, mixed, focused, lacking, thorough, unrealistic, reactive, paltry, unrealistic, future focused, and needs more collaboration. So I think that's helpful in hearing a little bit of the sentiment of where you all are at right now and kind of how you're feeling about Boston's climate planning. For those who are feeling mixed or slow, I really look forward to hearing your questions in the Q&A, especially about kind of your thoughts on this plan. Again, throughout the presentation, you can add your questions at slido.com. Alice will be monitoring that, and they'll appear later in our Q&A section as kind of a filtered list, but Alice can bring those in at any time. So let me just switch back over to Google Slides.
Sanjay, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that Representative Beal is here. Representative Beal, I don't know if you want to quickly hop in and say hi or chat after the presentation.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Just want to thank you all for being on the call today. Looking forward to today's dialogue and conversations around what we can do to protect Boston and around climate change and climate resiliency measures. So thank you for your time, and I hope everybody's doing well this morning.
Thanks, Representative.
Great. So again, thank you all for going through some of those apps and figuring that out. That really helps me think about how to share this with all of you. So before we dig into Dorchester, just a brief overview of Climate Ready Boston. As everyone on the call likely knows, in 2016, Boston published a citywide report, Climate Ready Boston, and we've been doing detailed district level analyses ever since to really build out the city's to-do lists. Which now, number in the several billions of dollars worth of infrastructure and programs and growing when it comes to what Boston needs to do to protect itself from the impacts of climate change. In 2019, and many of the folks on this call worked on that, we completed a vision for Moakley Park to close off flood pathways in that area, while also improving open space amenities and waterfront access, and protecting critical neighborhoods, including significant public housing. And as Bud mentioned at the top of the call, we recently completed both the North End and Downtown study and this report on Dorchester. We also recently launched a planning process to cover the remaining sections of East Boston and Charlestown. And we will soon be launching next month a citywide planning process focused on heat resiliency and environmental justice. This slide should be familiar to many of the people on the call because it's been around since 2016. And it really just describes the city's layered approach to resilience and adaptation, which focuses on buildings, neighborhoods, districts, ordinances, zoning, public education, and a wide range of interventions to help achieve a citywide strategy. There's no silver bullet in this stuff. You kind of need to do a lot of different approaches, and they all need to kind of work together. So that's just kind of a framework that Boston has brought to its work. And as these plans that we're presenting today and we will be presenting in the future are implemented, they'll help achieve the vision presented in 2018 for a resilient Boston Harbor, which focuses on a continuous system of protection for 47 miles of shoreline in Boston Harbor. While we're here, obviously today to talk about Dorchester, it's important to remember that this is, we want the city of Boston as a whole to achieve these outcomes, and the city is focused on actions for buildings, neighborhoods, and districts in Dorchester in the context of this citywide strategy. So in terms of starting with conclusions, which is never a bad place to start, Dorchester is risky today. It's the site of several flood entry points for the city. And under severe storms, Dorchester already experiences flood risks that could be significantly damaging and could cause, up to $67 million in flood damage. to structures and property. So that risk will increase substantially in the years to come if we don't act, but it is present today. Of course, in every single district plan and including Dorchester, it's very complicated. There's very complex ownership and activities along the waterfront in Dorchester, and the city of Boston owns almost none of the waterfront, a little less than 5% of the waterfront. So it's clear that there's a role for city, state, federal, nonprofit, and private partners to collaborate in this work. We also know that it's urgent. Boston is acutely aware of the time that large infrastructure projects can take. And we know that climate change is not waiting for us. And even within the next decade, we expect significant increases in risk and exposure that will take the kind of today risk of about $67 million for a major flood event to, under 9 inches of sea level rise, up to $330 million in damages. So the damages grow significantly over even just, within the next decade, and we really do need to move forward quickly. And lastly, Boston Harbor Now knows this very well. This work is really on all of us. And so while we continue to identify all of these priority projects and to-do lists and secure funding for pilot projects or demonstration projects or smaller sections of this, the scale of the funding in all of the Climate Ready Boston projects runs in the several billions of dollars, and it crosses, as I mentioned previously, public, private, city, state, and federal lines. So we all have a role to play in getting these to-do lists done, and everyone who values an accessible waterfront, a thriving city, and a safe community has a stake in it. So thank you for your continued leadership in this space. Great. Preamble done. With that said, let's dig into the report and get into this in a little more detail. Again, you can go to slido.com with code 7440 and add your questions as we go. So the Dorchester report, right? What is Dorchester? It includes 9.5 miles of shoreline, about a fifth of Boston's total shoreline, including areas like Moakley Park and the Neponset River Reservation and Greenway. So as with the other neighborhood studies, the primary goal of this planning process was really to equitably reduce coastal flood risk, right? That's the core. And then additionally, to make sure that Boston can thrive in the face of climate change, this report identified solutions that enhance access and mobility. There's some issues in Dorchester when it comes to who can access what. Promote the health of valuable ecosystems. There's some critical ecosystems throughout Dorchester. And reinforce a connected, cohesive sense of place. The plan is a product of extensive engagement with stakeholders since June of 2019, including, I believe, 5 steering committees, 2 open houses with the community, 24 stakeholder interviews, 2 online community surveys, and 12 engagements at community meetings. So a pretty extensive planning process. And for the folks on the call who are involved in it, thank you for all of your work in making this happen. This planning process involved engagement with 9 city agencies, 3 state agencies, 8 private and institutional stakeholders, 11 NGOs and CBOs and resident groups, and the broader Dorchester community. These are some photos from those engagements, which included a new way of communicating to residents about climate change, including some 360-degree VR experiences to understand what flooding would look like in the future. And we worked with a wide range of participants in both open houses, helping them understand the challenges we're facing and how they can address them together. So over the next few slides, I'll just be placing us in the context of Dorchester. For those on the call who have less familiarity with Dorchester, only about 6% of people said they live and work there. This series of slides might be helpful. For those who are very familiar, it can just be a good reminder of why this work is both important and urgent. First, in terms of open spaces, Dorchester obviously has a wide variety of open spaces with proximity to Franklin Park, Moakley Park, and the Neponset River Reservation. Within Dorchester, residents have access to neighborhood parks and playgrounds. However, as will be a theme in this kind of series of slides, residents in the inland neighborhoods closer to Franklin Park have significant difficulty accessing the waterfront and crossing transportation infrastructure to access all of the things that Dorchester's waterfront can offer. So that's why this plan focuses on any resiliency improvements that are done in Dorchester that not only achieve the goal of flood risk reduction, but also make sure that all residents can benefit from these investments. So on this map, you can see a range of open spaces in Dorchester and near Dorchester. Again, for those familiar with reading these kinds of maps, you can see why it might be challenging to access the waterfront. There's major transportation lines and regional commuter rail lines that cross through the neighborhood, which serve and connect residents to areas outside of Dorchester, but also make it hard to cross east to west or west to east in the neighborhood. So on this map, the red line you see is the MBTA red line, which runs near the waterfront edge, and also represents a rail corridor that's pretty tough to cross, and kind of reinforces the division between inland and waterfront areas. At the southern edge of the neighborhood is the Neponset River estuary, which is over 500 acres of protected lands that provide beneficial ecosystem services, as well as open spaces and recreational opportunities. So on this map, you can see, I'm going to start using my pointer a little bit. You can see this area outlined in orange, which is the ASEC. It's a protected area of the Neponset River. And you can also see some additional tidal mudflats and beaches along the waterfront edge of Dorchester. And Alice, if my pace is good or too fast, feel free to just flag me. Great. So this is a very interesting map because it tells a story about what we need to fix in terms of who has access to these resources. Dorchester has nearly 20% of Boston's population, so massive neighborhood, and people of color make up nearly 80% of the neighborhood. However, access to waterfront amenities is often unequal due to issues with connectivity. So on this map, you see lots of colored dots. This is a classic map in most planning things. The dots on this map correspond to the race of the residents, and the legend is in the left-hand corner. And so you can see that there are different groupings throughout the neighborhood that reflect kind of the built environment, how the neighborhood has been settled, and also, you know, you can get a sense of how the neighborhood is split up and how connections into the inland neighborhoods are going to be critical to making sure that everyone has access to these improvements on the waterfront that also protect from flood risk. Second to last in this series, before we dig into the actual coastal flood risk itself, as I mentioned at the top, Dorchester is largely owned by folks other than the city of Boston. So less than 5% of the shoreline is owned by the city of Boston. Most of it's actually owned by the Commonwealth, and privately owned areas making up the rest. So about 7.2 miles are owned by the Commonwealth, 1.7 miles are owned by private folks, and then about 0.3 is owned by the city and by the federal government. So obviously that can be a benefit, and it means that collaboration is really important, and our partners in the Commonwealth and elsewhere are really critical to being partners in implementing these plans. The major landowners and asset owners are of course, the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation and the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. So on this map, anything in kind of this yellowy orange is state-owned land. And you can see how that'll intersect with our flood risk in a bit. Last in this series of just context setting slides before we get into the flood risk, you'll see this in every resiliency presentation in Boston, just because filled lands and historic waterways that were filled and then built upon often are also sites of flood risk. So the yellow in this map are areas, former waterways or wetlands that were filled in order to allow for development. And just note these areas and remember them when it comes to learning more about flood risk in the neighborhood. So with all of that said, you know, this planning process came up with lots of different options, and we filtered all of those options that we will ultimately present later in this presentation through a series of evaluation criteria. It's just a fancy way of saying there's a lot of different policy priorities. How do we balance all of them? And we wanted to ensure that any option we suggested for Dorchester would not only be effective and feasible, but also improve the quality of life for residents. Whew. Okay, so that's a quick overview of Dorchester itself and of some of the parts of our planning process. Obviously, we could go in a lot more detail. Now we'll get into understanding actually the coastal flood risk in Dorchester. So depending upon the size of your screen, this may be either very easy or slightly challenging to read, but this map shows flood risk in Dorchester today. So today, flood risk in Dorchester is very common in open spaces and roadways, which currently experience about a 1 in 10 chance of flooding in any given year, or what's called a 10% flood exceedance probability, but it's easier just to say 1 in 10. Additionally, areas like Morrissey Boulevard and the Bay City site, which are both circled in red on the map, currently experience a 1 in 100 chance of flooding in any given year. So every year you roll the dice. If you roll a 1, you get a flood out of a 100-sided die. Not a lot of those, but you know what I mean. The red arrows on the right side here of this map show how floodwaters would enter and expand across the Bay City site from an area along the water's edge. So as with all of our other district plans, it's kind of a theme to try to identify how does the water enter the neighborhood and extend across low-lying parts of our city. On the map, areas in this kind of light blue color are other areas where there's currently today a 1 in 100 chance of flooding each year. And if such a flood were to occur, as I mentioned earlier, it would cause around $67 million in damage. Okay, so this map is a similar map, but it shows flood risk under 9 inches of sea level rise, which we currently expect within the next decade. So areas circled in orange here, Neponset Circle, Port Norfolk, Clam Point, and Morrissey Boulevard North. These areas represent focus areas for near-term flood risk in the neighborhood, near-term meaning within the next decade. And the orange arrows that you see here, similar to the red arrows in the past slide, they're showing you how floodwaters enter the neighborhood. And they also are showing you, they're kind of alluding to areas where solutions are really needed in the near term, because closing off a flood pathway, which just means a space where water enters the neighborhood, can really protect a lot of the areas behind it. So you can see those in this slide here. Similar to the prior map, areas shown in light blue here, which are more extensive, under 9 inches of sea level rise, experience a 1 in 100 chance of having a major flood, and would, if there was that flood, it would result in about $330 million in damages. All right, and now the big one. So finally, this map shows flood risk under 40 inches of sea level rise. We currently expect that by 2070, but it could be and likely will be sooner. While 2070 may sound far away, the average age of Boston's housing stock currently is around 50 years. So, the decisions we make today about how and where we build and what we do as a city, those are the ones we're going to have to live with when 2070 comes around. In many cases. So, it's not as far away as you think. On this map, we can see major new flood entryways in the Pine Neck Creek, Neponset Wetlands, and Morrissey Boulevard South. And the yellow arrows similarly show you how floodwaters enter the Dorchester neighborhood. You'll see at Harbor Point, this is Harbor Point right here next to the Bay City development or site. You see that it would experience very significant flooding across the entire area of that site. And, if we experience this flood, this 1 in 100 chance flood, it would cause around $860 million worth of damages. So very significant damage associated with future flooding. For folks who are used to reading these kinds of maps, this is talking about water depth. And as the color gets closer to orange, that means that the water is deeper. The red color is about 10 feet. And so basically the thing to take from this map is that you can see that there's pockets throughout the neighborhood in the Neponset Wetlands over here along Port Norfolk with substantial flood depths, in the Pine Neck Creek area along Morrissey Boulevard here, and on the Bay City site, where we would, without action, obviously, we would expect some significant flood depths. And for those who are less familiar, I know many of us are experts on the call, but a lot of the damage associated with flooding depends upon the depth and duration of flooding. And so the deeper the flood and the longer the flood, the more likely you are to cause major damage to a structure. Great. So we don't have to dig into this too much, but if there's any questions on the call or any clarifying questions, please feel free to add them into the chat, and we can always pause.
Sanjay, there's a clarifying question about design flood elevation. I don't know if you're going to get to that later or if you want to interject it here.
Yeah, of course. So thanks for asking that question.
Well, the question is about what the requirements are, because apparently there's some
The
mismatch.
mismatch between requirements, I think, so I would love to get into that question in more detail. Yeah,
But we'll get to it later.
I have a whole chart of DFEs for across the neighborhood that we can pull up towards the end.
We'll get there.
But thanks for your question.
Great.
Okay, so that's a little bit about the flood risk. And, it's important to understand what we would be protecting. So this map shows some of the community and ecological assets. In this map, we're showing flooding under 40 inches of sea level rise, so a major coastal storm under 40 inches of sea level rise. In particular, in this case, at risk are several of the schools, a community center, and many other neighborhood institutions, as well as significant impacts to open spaces, which tend to be in Dorchester, significantly along the waterfront. So, flooding will obviously impact many community assets. Of course, Dorchester, as we kind of alluded to earlier, there's a lot of transportation infrastructure that runs through Dorchester and supports Dorchester. Within this century, all of Dorchester's current evacuation routes, if we don't act, including I-93 South, Morrissey Boulevard, Neponset Avenue, Gallatin Boulevard, all of those will be exposed to coastal flooding and sea level rise. And so, when you think about protecting the safety of Bostonians, making sure that there's always a clear evacuation route is really critical. These floods, if there were floods of these routes, that would delay evacuation of the neighborhood, or they could lead to delays in traffic. So for example, a 5 to 15 minute traffic delay along Morrissey Boulevard would be estimated to cost around $2.5 to $5.5 million per day, just in terms of the cost of lost time to residents. So these things add up. And as we get more and more of these kind of soft impacts of climate change over time, delays more than full-on disruptions, those also have a cost, and we need to deal with those. And lastly, this map shows the range of buildings that are impacted under a major coastal storm with 40 inches of sea level rise. So on this map, again, apologies if you're on a small screen, it might be tough to see, but the yellow shade represents residential buildings. Red represents commercial or commercial buildings. And so this is why, as I mentioned earlier, a major flood under 9 inches of sea level rise expected in the next decade would create about $330 million of damages to these structures. You can see kind of where those structures are located and what type they are. But under kind of the storm that we designed to, the 40 inches of sea level rise, nearly 900 residential structures, 250 commercial structures, and 60 governmental structures, in addition to schools and industry, would be impacted. Okay, so that's kind of the end of just introducing the flood risk and what we're protecting. We're going to start heading into the to-do list, so you can understand kind of what we've put in the plan as the city's to-do list to get this work done and protect this community. So, because so many of the folks on this call do this for their profession, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of the kind of the vocabulary of coastal resilience solutions here, other than to say that, we looked at a wide range of potential solutions in this plan, and any solution in Boston, when you talk about doing stuff at the water's edge, really requires a really creative approach and a mix of solutions and a layered approach. So it's not that you just build a big hill to prevent the water from coming in. It's not that you just put up a wall, but you have to do all sorts of things, both in water, on land, and throughout a neighborhood to make sure that you're providing a comprehensive solution. So, I'm happy to share these slides out afterwards if anyone wants to dig into these more, but essentially, and this is all covered in our plan, but there's a lot of different solutions that are typical for these planning processes, including walls and tide gates. And, ultimately there are also nature-based solutions and building level adaptations. So not every solution is going to be a big berm or a big wall. Some things might actually just be improving individual buildings themselves, like in the Port Norfolk neighborhood, which we'll get into soon. So when we were developing these solutions, we split the neighborhood into different risk zones. And so these aren't arbitrary, they're actually based upon kind of shared flood pathways, shared risk, and kind of the structure of potential alignments. From left to right, we have the Neponset riverfront. In yellow, the Neponset Circle and Adams Village. In greenish, the Clam Point and Tenean Beach zone. In green proper, Port Norfolk, and in blue, Columbia Point and Morrissey Boulevard. So we're going to go through each of these risk zones and talk about what's on our to-do list. It's obviously important to note that coastal resilience solutions within each of these zones are mutually interdependent. And what that means is, in Columbia Point and Morrissey Boulevard, in order to achieve protection of that risk zone, you have to do all of the things in that risk zone. You can't pick and choose and achieve the level of protection that you want, because these work together as a continuous system. So that's, again, why these are split into risk zones, and why there's kind of sequenced opportunities near term and long term to think about assembling a comprehensive and connected line of protection. So we're going to start with Columbia Point and Morrissey Boulevard. And there's really three major areas for coastal resilience solutions for this neighborhood. We have Moakley Park over here, Moakley Park, Bay City, Harbor Point. So this section is kind of one. There's the Morrissey Boulevard section, and then there's the kind of Savin Hill, McConnell Park section. So at Moakley Park, which, as many of the folks on this call know, is subject to ongoing planning and design work, there'll be some berms used in the park to keep out floodwaters, and those will be connected up into South Boston. So again, achieving connected protection means connecting into other neighborhoods. And they'll also connect to the flood protections that will be built on the site of Bay City. Finally, over the long term, so this is kind of the near term. Over the long term, this harbor walk will need to be elevated to reach the design flood elevation, which we can talk about again later, of about 16.1 feet, while ensuring that residents still can engage with the shoreline, access the waterfront, as with all of these solutions. We'll skip Morrissey for now. We'll go into a little more depth there. And at Savin Hill, there's an opportunity to explore resiliency improvements at McConnell Park, which could be done by raising sections of the park while maintaining existing recreational uses and neighborhood connections. And some of the buildings highlighted near McConnell Park, so you'll see this in a couple different risk zones, are highlighted in kind of a dark green. Those are buildings that will likely need to undertake building level adaptation. And that just means there are things you can do as a homeowner to protect yourself from flooding, dealing with subgrade, things in the basement, dealing with where your electricals are at, things like that. But Morrissey, which you'll hear a lot about throughout this, there's a near-term flood pathway that can be closed by raising the roadway at the intersection of Morrissey and Bianculli Boulevard to 16.1 feet, and tying into the high ground at Columbia Point. So this is the intersection we're talking about right here. And there's high ground here and here that you can tie into to close off that flood entryway. But the only way you can close off that flood entryway is also to install a tide gate. And a tide gate is just a way of preventing water from coming into Patton's Cove and then flooding out into the neighborhood. So for those who aren't familiar with reading section drawings, this is like you're cutting a little slice through the land and looking at it from the side. So you don't need to understand these section drawings to get the point of this, which is essentially there's two options we presented in the report. The first option really just focuses on taking Morrissey and raising it to 16.1 feet, right? It's very clear. You create a wall by using the elevated roadway, and that allows you to prevent water from coming into the neighborhood. The other option is to raise the road just to 10 feet and also build a landscape berm on the waterfront edge that raises to 16.1 feet. So for those who enjoy looking at section drawings, That option is right here. This is the idea of a landscaped berm to 16.1 feet, and the road would be raised to 10 feet over here. That would provide the same level of flood protection for Morrissey Boulevard, but it would also allow us to achieve some additional waterfront improvements in terms of supporting additional modes of travel, making sure that we are supporting additional recreational uses and providing ecological benefits to this community. And with either option here presented here, we propose adding living shoreline elements. So that really just means, living shoreline just means creating habitat for the various critters that are in our harbor and using that to improve our ecosystem and slow down both wave action and erosion. So erosion is something that makes it really complicated to do this work. You need to make sure that these berms are stable because they are the basis of your flood protection, and berms are just very strategic piles of dirt. So you want to make sure those stay where they need to be. So that's a little bit about Morrissey. In each of these risk zones, I'll go into the phasing. So these maps show in pink what we categorize as a catalytic project, or more simply just a next step project. And these catalytic projects represent opportunities to move forward quickly with a high value project that addresses near-term risks. So on the left map are projects in gray that are largely in the pipeline, in orange that we recommend as near-term projects, or in pink that we recommend as our next steps. On these maps, you can see that, as I mentioned, this Morrissey Boulevard, raising Morrissey Boulevard, putting in a tide gate, increasing public access, and thinking about living shoreline elements there, that's our next step in this section. And then we have, connections between Moakley and Bay City as a way to kind of define the line. Bay City will be looking at some connection here or generally across the site. And then for the Harbor Point community, raising that harbor walk to an interim elevation that would be increased later as floods grow. And on the right, we see long-term projects. So in this kind of greenish color are the long-term projects, and in the purple are so-called strategic opportunities, which are essentially saying at some point, some of these assets are going to come up for redesign, improvement, repair, just in the normal state of things. And when that happens, that's always a great time to start thinking about resiliency and how to bake it in when you're already doing a lot of this work, because some of it's really just about thinking about your elevations. But in these long-term projects, we see increasing the existing height. So this is in green now instead of in orange, because increasing the height of the harbor walk along Harbor Point, expanding building level adaptation at Savin Hill. So this, some additional buildings will need to think about how they protect themselves in this context. And you can also see, moving from a tide gate system to protect from flooding entering the neighborhood to a berm around Patton's Cove. So at some point, a tide gate's not going to get you far enough, and you're going to need to think about how do you prevent this kind of flood entry point from happening. So that's a little bit about this risk zone. We could go into a ton of detail into any segment of this, but at a high level, we prepared some preliminary cost benefit analysis and some costing for these projects. And so the catalytic project in this case, we expect to cost in the area of $55 million. And it has a benefit cost ratio of 1.5 to 4. So for the folks who do this for their career, they might know what that means. For folks who are just coming into this space, that essentially means that, what's benefit cost is just for every dollar you spend, how many dollars of benefit do you get? In this case, a 1.5 to 4 just means for every dollar we spend on this project at 55 million, we get 1.5 to $4 in benefits. And discount rates, which is also on the right, and you don't need to understand to get this, you can just focus on the benefit cost, but the discount rate just tells you kind of value today versus value in the future, how much dollar or some benefit is worth to you today versus receiving it in the future, and that difference is just the discount. And so public sector tends to use a lower discount rate, because we are a long-term organization. But the 7% is also there as a way to just kind of help people gauge where these projects land. Lastly, in this risk area, anything in purple on this map. So on the left is a 1% chance storm, or a 1 in 100 chance storm with 9 inches of sea level rise. And on the right is the same, but with 40 inches of sea level rise. Anything in purple, again, are areas that would be at risk of flooding if we didn't act. And anywhere remaining in this kind of light blue shade are areas that would still be at risk with the coastal resilience solutions offered in this report. And you can see that those are kind of not obviously populated areas. So that is our first risk zone. Moving forward, Clam Point and Tenean Beach. So this is our second risk zone. It includes 2 major coastal resilience areas. So in this case, we have Morrissey Boulevard South up here. And I think everyone can see my pointer, but let me know if you can't. And Victory Park and Tenean Beach, which is this segment here. So at Victory Park and Tenean Beach in the near term, we put on our to-do list a range of open space enhancements, including an expanded beach, improving resilience, and providing improved amenities on the site itself. There's also this here, which is the Conley Street underpass, where a deployable barrier, which just means something you can put up before a storm to prevent water from entering a neighborhood, can be done in the near term to address near-term flood risk. We also have on our list a low berm to about 12.5 feet at the back edge of the park that helps mitigate some of the near-term flood risk. In the long term, at Victory Park and Tenean Beach, this low berm would have to be raised from 12.5 feet to 16 feet, and would also have to be augmented. So this is the MBTA line here. It would have to be augmented by a flood wall along that corridor to make sure that important transit is not disrupted by flooding. A lot of people depend on the red line to get around the city. And so that's a little bit about this area. When you think about an elevated berm here, it's not a wall barring people from the park. It's actually going to provide a raised park and overlook that allows for active recreation and access to the beach, and also improving and protecting nearby ecological areas. So lastly, you can see this friendly wavy pink line, and that's really a continuous waterfront boardwalk. So making sure that we can connect Victory Park and Tenean Beach to the Port Norfolk community and vice versa, and that we improve connectivity across the waterfront so more people can use it. Again, for those who like sections, these are more sections. For those who don't worry. The graphic on the top just shows you Morrissey Boulevard and how you could put 2 piles of dirt on either side very strategically and close the flood pathway to that boulevard while maintaining waterfront access and a bike waterfront path. So that's all this shows. 2 piles of dirt, very strategic. You have some pathways to make sure that people have transit options and Morrissey's protected. And then the graphic on the bottom outlines a relationship between Tenean Beach, the berm behind the beach, Conley Street, and the MBTA infrastructure behind it. So let me see if I can, I can't move that, but essentially you have this berm, you have Conley Street, and you have a flood wall here. And so this all meets a specific design flood elevation that ensures that these areas are protected and also still accessible. While we all might be a little jaded when it comes to renderings of kites and birds and trees and kids, this is truly a faithful understanding of the vision we have for the waterfront, which is resilient, accessible, recreational, and ensuring a connection with the waterfront for residents, even as we utilize berms, raised roads, and other interventions to reduce flood impacts. A little moment of wonder before getting back into the maps. In this risk zone, the catalytic project is Tenean Beach Phase 1. and the Conley Street deployable. So this is our next step project. And this project, so that's kind of right here, outlined in very helpfully in pink. That's our next step project. And as I mentioned, that involves creating a low landscape berm at 12.5 feet, raising Conley to ensure that we have access to that road during an emergency, and improving pedestrian bike uses along Conley. In the long term, so this green is just illustrating the flood wall at MBTA, the elevated berm, the enhanced boardwalk components, and Morrissey. The plan also identifies a range of strategic opportunities, which I won't go into a lot of detail here, largely involving the Southeast Expressway, Clam Point, and Garvey Playground. So in this case, like we did in the last one, the cost of the catalytic project is estimated around $17 million, and it has a benefit cost ratio of anywhere from 2 to 6, which in the world of resilient stuff is great. Again, as with the prior maps, you can see areas in purple, which are being removed from flood risk as a result of these solutions that we propose. So again, on the left is 9 inches, on the right is 40 inches of sea level rise with a major coastal storm. And those areas in purple are areas that would be protected by the actions we would take. Okay, our third risk zone. So now we're in Port Norfolk. In this area, we have extensive flood risk, as we discussed earlier, but we don't have a lot of high land to tie flood protection into here. This is a peninsula, and the high land is really behind the peninsula itself. So, excuse me, in order to maintain access in and out of the neighborhood during an emergency, while also protecting against flood risk, we have on our to-do list to raise the roads in the neighborhood to 12.5 feet, which reduces flood risk down to like a 1 in 50 chance or a 2% chance of experiencing a major storm that can damage the neighborhood under 9 inches of sea level rise. And again, if any of this is unclear, please make sure to add stuff in the Q&A, and we can go into it in a lot of detail during that section. So this raising the roads here is very similar to raising the berm at Tenean Beach in terms of giving you a similar risk profile. So a 1 in 50 chance of experiencing a major storm. This elevated road, so, you know, elevating a road at Port Norfolk, it would provide near-term protection, but it wouldn't have a major impact on nearby properties because of the way the neighborhood is structured, the types of housing there. There would be a need for building level adaptation in Port Norfolk over the near and long term, which is highlighted in this dark green color. And, you know, in the long term, Port Norfolk has some choices about how we proceed. We can continue and extend building level adaptation to match increases in flood risk, which is very much the preferred option. Or we can explore the potential for creating a perimeter protection system of berms and flood walls that meets the 16-foot design flood elevation. So the first alternative is likely preferable, not only because it retains people's connection to the waterfront and their existing views and doesn't require a major infrastructure project and is lower cost, but in terms of the second option, which would be, you know, building a series of perimeter protections and berms throughout the neighborhood. You know, you only get protection once those things are completed. So it's kind of a light switch approach to dealing with risk versus kind of a slowly getting safer approach. And so in this case, it's not necessarily the best alternative for this neighborhood because those kinds of approaches require, you know, most of this is private landowners. So it would require a lot of coordination with private landowners. It would be complicated to construct due to the site constraints here, the higher costs, a range of environmental impacts that kind of solution can have, and the kind of blunt approach to risk that kind of solution represents for this neighborhood. Again, for the people who love sections, this is a diagram of what building level adaptation looks like. So these boxes represent homes. You can see a little stair, and this line represents the kind of new flood level that you'd want to adjust to. So buildings, will have support in terms of learning how to do this work. The city's prepared coastal flood resilience design guidelines, which support property owners in understanding their options for building level adaptations that they can do themselves to protect their homes. So when it comes to this kind of work, there's a lot of work to do just to figure out what do you do in your basement, how do you move stuff out of there, how do you deal with flood proofing, or even thinking about how to deal with 6-7 inches of water for a short period of time, and what does that look like for the types of improvements you might make naturally in the cycle of owning a home, and how to think about that ahead of time, which is definitely the goal in all of this. So now we're on the phasing slide, which just, again, on the left is the near term, on the right is the long term. On the right, we see extended building level adaptation over the long term. So all of these highlighted in this kind of orangey color, these buildings are near term. And the ones highlighted in this kind of blue-green color are long term. So you can see that in the near term, the majority of the buildings would need to adapt. And in the long term, an additional set of buildings would also need to adapt. As I mentioned, this building level adaptation is very cost effective. It's estimated to be about $45 million less than the alternative of building berms and walls around the entire neighborhood, and has nearly double the cost benefit ratio. So those are wonky terms. They're just ways of measuring the performance of a project against all the other projects you could possibly build. And that's what is on our to-do list for this neighborhood. Additionally, there's some other things we can talk about around kind of how do you protect from the backside for floodwaters coming in, and connections to other sections of the planning process. What you see here is a little different than in the other maps, because you see areas that we're protecting also still highlighted in light blue. In that case, there would still be flooding in these areas. However, the buildings would be adapted to those floods. So it's a little less impactful. If those buildings are designed to live with the water, then the water is just there. It's just a feature for the day. It's not a disaster. Looking at the time, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So we're going to go slightly quicker through these ones, but there's also a little less to cover in terms of detail. So Neponset Circle and Adams Village. This is the next risk area. We have two main areas for coastal resilience solutions: the Neponset Circle waterfront area and the Davenport Creek area. So Davenport Creek is kind of simple. You put a tide gate there and you close the flood pathway. Water comes in through this kind of semi-natural, semi-built creek, and you can just put a gate there to prevent that from happening during a major storm. For Neponset Circle, we presented two alternatives. This is an example of the preferred option, which is shown again in section. And you can see the berm here, the big strategic dirt hill, dirt plus other things. I'm not trying to be, so that's here. And that would raise the elevation to 14.4 feet. So the design flood elevation in this section of the neighborhood is a little bit lower, just based off of the way water moves in the harbor and how it intersects with this landmass. And then this option would not only create this berm, which you can see kind of extending here, but it would also create additional opportunities for active recreation, ecological value, landscape, and shoreline elements. So, you could do the alternative, which is really just leaving everything as is and raising the harbor walk to the same elevation. Obviously, if you look at these two options, you see just, differences in terms of ecological and recreational value that are offered there. In terms of phasing, this is our fourth catalytic project that is our next step project in the plan. And we estimate that this would cost about $3 million less than the alternative of just raising the harbor walk. So, we estimate it would cost around $11 million to do this option. and a benefit cost ratio that is positive or more than 1. In the near term, this tide gate here at Davenport Creek is in our near-term study, as well as some additional work at Pope John Paul II Park to understand adaptation pathways there. And in the long term, ultimately you need to look at, over here on the right, in the long term, ultimately an extension of this Neponset Trail to close off what is an expanding flood pathway that would otherwise come into the neighborhood here. Again, this shows areas that are protected by interventions in purple. And you can see how much of the area is protected by closing off those flood pathways. Our last risk area, the Neponset Riverfront, is a little different because the development here is largely low density, and it's largely wetlands and protected areas. So it's a different context than some of our other risk areas. And it includes building level adaptation in the near and long term, adapted rail and road infrastructure to raise roads and make sure that we have dry evacuation routes for everyone, and some consideration of strategic location for low density sites along the waterfront. In terms of phasing, in the near term on the left, we see building level adaptation for 5 buildings, some road raising, some additional study of the wetlands monitoring, and additional study of cedar groves. And in the long term on the right, we see additional building level adaptation for about 25 buildings, elevating a portion of the Neponset River Reservation Park to 12.5 feet to deal with some of the flooding. And this kind of works together. The reason that we discuss some consideration of strategic relocation in the context of the Lower Mills sub area is how our benefit cost came out. So it's below 1 in this case. And so the cost of doing everything you would need to do to reduce your flood risk may not be dollar for dollar worth the benefit. And so there is some, there will be the need to do building level adaptation for near-term flood risk. And over the very long term, it might be worth some consideration of strategic relocation. So that's a little bit about the Neponset River. You see a different picture here in terms of the dramaticness of the pink polygons in terms of how much is protected as a result of these solutions, just because these solutions mostly focus on maintaining the existing function of the wetlands, protecting the rail infrastructure, and doing building level adaptation. So in summary, and now we'll have a solid 20 minutes for Q&A. This map maps the kind of 4 catalytic projects we've identified with pink stars: Morrissey, Tenean Beach, Conley Street, and Neponset Circle, and the orange in the near term. Again, in green is the long term, or green, blue, depending upon your level of color blindness. And what you can notice in each of these is that they're phased to address the way that flood risk enters the neighborhood over time. And they each tie into each other in a thoughtful way to create a continuous system of protection. Lastly, there are some strategic opportunities to jump in and bake resilience into existing assets once they come up for improvement in the capital cycle. We won't go into this in a lot of detail. There's a phasing strategy in our plan. We've talked a little bit about it, but the overall figures about how this plan shakes out in terms of costs and benefits, we're looking at anywhere from $111 to $215 million in costs. The large range there is ultimately a result of the level of detail you can get into in this kind of planning study in terms of engineering and design. So that's why you're seeing a big range, but that's where we would see the cost of this project falling. But it's important to remember that even with 9 inches of sea level rise, which we expect within the next decade, we would experience likely around $330 million in damage. So it's clear why in this plan, we end up with a cost benefit ratio of around 1.4 to 4.2, which means that it's, for every dollar we spend, we get more than that in returns in terms of avoided damages and things like that. Whew. All right, what's next for Climate Ready Boston? So we are kicking off our citywide heat resilience strategy in February, which will be looking at the impacts of extreme heat, especially on environmental justice communities in Boston, and thinking about a range of solutions we can use to address heat in the near and long term, as well as metrics to measure performance over time for the city. Our colleagues at the BPDA are leading some work on East Boston resilient design options, digging into more detail into some of the phase 1 climate ready work and providing some additional options there. We are, as I mentioned, in the middle of our East Boston and Charlestown phase 2 work, which includes all of the areas of those neighborhoods that weren't included in the first phase. And our colleagues at the BPDA are leading the Coastal Flood Resilience Overlay District work that is looking at how do you bake resiliency into zoning. And this is among many other things that are happening here at the city. Thank you for those who are still awake for being a part of this conversation and this presentation. I really look forward to hearing your Q&As, which I'm going to reopen Slido. So if you have any questions, make sure to put those in the chat. And again, feel free to reach out by email. There may be questions that I might not have the details for on this call in particular, but I'm happy to answer questions over email if that occurs. So let me open the question app thing and then.
Sanjay, we have quite a few questions that have come in via the chat as well. So we can maybe start with
from
some of
anywhere,
those too.
yeah.
And I want to acknowledge that Patrick Ford from Senator Collins' office has joined us. So Patrick, I don't know if you want to say a quick hello. We can come back to Patrick too. We have a question from Marianne Connolly about collaboration and coordination with DCR and MassDOT. Marianne, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. It struck me that since so much of the land is owned by other entities like DCR, MassDOT, and BTA, are they as fully engaged in this process as they should be, particularly when it comes down to decision-making and looking at costs?
Thank you, Marianne. So I can't speak for them, but they are our partners, and they've been really important partners in developing this plan and this planning process. And we'll be engaging them fully in kind of the implementation side of this. So, you know, I won't make any characterizations about that. I think they've been really good partners in developing this work. And, you know, I think, especially when it comes to things like Morrissey, you know, there have been plans already in place before we even started this planning process. So it's also, you know, they've been moving on this too, and independently of this process. So it's a really important partnership.
Thank you.
Great. We have a question from Tom Reddy about the availability of grants or low interest loans. Tom, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Alice. I recognize that not just in Dorchester, but in a number of other locations around the city shoreline, that some of the areas that are at risk, as you had mentioned, are private homes. And I also recognize grant money is probably not rolling around, otherwise it would be in play somewhere. But clearly a low interest loan model or something to assist especially low income homeowners to help with remediation efforts for their homes would clearly needs to be looked at. Something similar to what has been done in the past with things like clean energy, you know, some of these energy grants, right, where you swap out your furnace and get something a little more efficient. So Sanjay, I didn't know if any of that was in the discussion phases, right?
So Tom, thanks for that question. I think, you know, where the kind of funding and financing of private homeowners improvements is at largely is with, currently at least with FEMA and with kind of, you know, post-disaster, folks can access individual assistance through the IA program of FEMA. You know, I fully agree that finding ways, especially for low-income residents, to figure out how to fund and finance their improvements is going to be critical to the overall, not just getting the flood risk down, but making sure that, you know, flood risk doesn't push people away from neighborhoods that they've loved and enjoyed for a long time. So, you know, no conversations to report out to you in terms of where things are are at on that right now. I think this conversation about implementation is also, I think your analogy of energy efficiency retrofits, things like that, and how that could be an analogy to resilience is important. One of the projects that we'll be working to put out there and get started a little later this year is focusing on resilience retrofits and helping residents assess their resilience in their current structure, in their building, in their home, and think about ways to fund and finance that. So it's definitely something on our radar, something we want to figure out how we can be supportive, in addition to all the other kind of state and federal and philanthropic programs that focus on protecting those residents. But thank you for your question, Tom.
Great. Our next question is from Magdalena Ayed about the expanded wetland possibilities.
Yes. Hi, Alice. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sanjay, for the presentation. So my question is, I saw in the slides that part of the resilience solutions includes expanding the wetlands. And so my question is, obviously with the lack of wetland protections that we have around Boston, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that the city is going to make a commitment, or the state, to actually create or recreate more wetlands so that they can be protected? So like what's under the Wetlands Protection Act? Or does it mean like sort of living shoreline projects? Because the more wetlands we can recreate, and if we can expand our wetlands, obviously that's better for flood protection anyway. So I just have that question.
Great. Thanks for your question, Magdalena. Yeah, I mean, in a city that is built upon many wetlands, especially the ones we have left, are really critical. So the study looked at kind of monitoring wetlands over time, especially in areas that are already protected. So, the Neponset River kind of reservation area is an ASEC, an area of critical environmental concern, regulated by the Department of DCR. So there's already a significant level of protection. How wetlands respond to climate change is currently an area of significant research. And so what does it take to make sure the wetlands maintain their current function under conditions of sea level rise? That is something that every coastal community is thinking about, and how do they maintain those functions? So that's why in this report, we recommended kind of monitoring those wetlands over time, looking at their accretion rates, thinking about, are they keeping up with sea level rise? If not, what can we do about it? So, it'll be an ongoing conversation, because the science is, as with many things in climate change, the science is kind of coming in, our understanding from kind of the data and the monitoring is coming in. And so we have to keep a really close eye on how our wetlands are performing in the context of climate change.
Great. Next question is from Spencer Grenenfelder. I hope I got that right. You asked about how you calculated damages. Do you want to ask your question live, Spencer?
Yeah, I'll ask it live. On your final slide, you had shown, or for each project, you had shown the value that you'll get from these projects. And then you mentioned that it was higher than the cost. How did you guys get to the number of expected damages from certain floods?
Great, thanks for that question. You can go into each individual section of the report and look at the benefits and costs and what we monetized and didn't monetize. So in a benefit cost analysis, there are some benefits that you put a dollar value to and you include in the analysis, and there's some that you don't, and similarly to the costs, because ultimately you can't measure every single benefit and every single cost. And so for every single kind of risk area, you can look at what was included. So for example, in the Neponset Riverfront risk area, the monetized benefits were avoided damages to buildings and their contents and associated functions, avoiding displacement and relocation costs, mental stress and anxiety, and loss of productivity. Those are very common things used in resilience studies to put a cost, or to put a benefit value to avoiding damage. And then there were a range of things that were not monetized there. And similarly on the cost side, the costs were really just the building level adaptation for residents in lower mills. So how much does it cost to do things like moving systems out of the basement, or flood proofing your first floor, or raising your structure? Those are all things that would fall under the idea of building level adaptation. And then there's additional costs in terms of transportation infrastructure upgrades and ecology that aren't pulled into that benefit cost ratio. So definitely invite you to dig into the report and look at each of those sections. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out over email.
Sounds good, thank you. And I like that a lot of these generally avoid private residences. So a lot of it is being done coordinating with, MassDOT and other groups. So it seems more feasible.
Great, thank you. And yeah, these are very conservative benefit costs. They're avoided damages and building level costs is kind of the kind of a very clear thing. So it's important to not go crazy with these things. But thanks for your question.
There's a couple of related questions to the fact that the question of report mentioning. Sanjay mentioned that some of this is in the report. In fact, most of these slides are coming straight from information available in the report. I'll put a link in the chat momentarily, but there is a question in Slido about will the presentation be available later. You can reach out to Sanjay directly to get the presentation. We'll also have a copy of this recording and you can check out the plan online. Our next question is from Bud about who's paying for what.
The privilege of being the chair.
Yeah. Sanjay, I don't know if you could put the slide back up of Columbia Point where Bayside City Development is. Maybe we're past that point, but as the city finishes all these plans, which they're almost done with, there's a big question about who should pay, which I know you're probably all thinking about grappling. I think there's a really interesting example of this with Bay City Development and then the Harbor Point complex right next door. There you go. So in the yellow there, the Bay City folks are, I think, fully prepared to pay for resilience measures that will protect their property and also some of the inland areas around them and, going towards Morrissey Boulevard. Then right next door, you have this the Harbor Point development, which it describes itself as a luxury gated community. And I'm wondering sort of what the expectation is. That, long stretch is a fairly expensive piece of this whole project, I assume, and what you all are thinking about whether Harbor Point would, even though it's an existing development, would be asked to chip in on that or, what, since they're major beneficiaries. Tough question, I'm sure.
I mean, I'm not going to negotiate that over this call. I think, I think the question of who benefits, who pays, how do we do this? It's something that is the question every coastal community faces, because ultimately the city, isn't going to wave a magic wand and have these things happen. A lot of cities wait until they have a major disaster and the federal government steps in to do this work. And ideally we do that beforehand and figure out the financing and funding before that. I think, when it comes to folks who are experiencing the benefits of protection, they have an incentive to make sure that protection works for them and meets their standards. So I think this is just, Bud, we're at the beginning of many, many long conversations about funding and financing. I'm glad that you bring focus to that in so many of our conversations, because that's ultimately how we get to see some of these things happen. That's my non-answer answer for you.
Right. I raise it just to encourage you all, as I know you're going to do, to really get clear once all these plans are done about what the expectations are for the private sector versus the public. And, and it obviously creates a lot of value, as you just said, that, the market value of that whole Harbor Point area will be dramatically increased once it's nicely protected. So it's just an example. I think there are others around the harbor that you all are going to have to grapple with. And I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you, Bud. Yeah, I mean, the challenge of using real estate value as a basis for protection and pay-in is obviously places that have lower real estate value aren't less worth protecting. Oftentimes that relates to other factors. So there's all sorts of policy dimensions to how you fund and finance, which I know you totally have been involved in so many reports that do that. So, we have a lot of policy considerations, a lot of other considerations, and the goal is ultimately to get these things built on the timeline that we've put out there. So
good.
TP, more will be here soon in that space. Thank you, Bud.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Kathy about retreat. Kathy, want to unmute?
Yeah, let me unmute. Sanjay, one of your slides actually had the word retreat on it, which
yes,
caught my eye. What are we doing? What's the city doing in terms of talking about, particularly with all the residents and businesses you showed that are at risk, and looking at the cost of what protecting those are and whether people want to continue to expose themselves to that risk? What are we doing? What's the city doing around the retreat option?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. You know, I prefer to call it strategic relocation. Retreat sounds like you're surrendering. It's really just like accepting the reality of what's happening. In some places, not every place needs to use that strategy, but strategic relocation is really about, like, you know, for private owners in low density areas, building a giant wall around them to protect a few single family homes is not necessarily the policy option that cities take, right? Typically, coastal cities, need to, there's a lot of things that we can spend money on in addition to all of our existing infrastructure and our schools and our services and everything. So there has to be a very clear justification for expending public dollars. And when it comes to, 8 single family homes that may be impacted by flooding, building a berm to protect those, the berm might be more expensive than the homes themselves. And while it can feel unfair to have that conversation with some folks, because, other people are getting protected and, what about my property? That's, obviously these are hard conversations to have. So the city's not, pointing at specific property owners and saying, you must go. No city does that. But, mentioning that in our work is an important just responsibility that we have, because there's a lot of uncertainty in climate work. And, we learn more every single year about the risks that we face and, and how we can deal with those. And so, depending upon people's own personal risk tolerances, whether it's their risk tolerance for a mortgage that they hold, or whether it's a risk tolerance just for their own safety, they may choose that being located in an area that will experience or currently experiences flood risk just isn't their lifestyle. And that's not something they want to think about before they go to bed. So, strategic relocation brings in all sorts of emotional components that people experience about risk, and also place and their connection to it that, as will be, a cornerstone of a lot of conversations that folks across the US will be experiencing, right? And in, Boston has a lot of places that we have straightforward to-do lists on how to protect them. And, obviously if we were in Louisiana, the story would be a little different. And it can be really challenging to think about, that you don't have necessarily high land to tie into and build a berm into. So thanks for the question, Kathy. I think, it's a conversation that we'll be continuing in every coastal city across the Boston region. And it's a really challenging conversation to have because, no one wants to leave places where they have a lot of memories.
Thanks, Sanjay.
Sanjay, we've got one person, anonymous person, so I would love to call on them, but I don't know who they are, who's asked 3 times in Slido the design flood elevation questions. I'm going to read verbatim the original one. Please clarify which design flood elevation will be used. The DFE in this report and Boston requirements don't match. Is it 15.04 or 16.2 NAV D88?
This sounds like an email question, just so we can be clear on the specifics of exactly what project they're referring to and which DFE what they're referencing. All of the DFEs for each risk area are given in the report in both NAV D88 and BCD, Boston City Base, so Boston City Datum. So this is the slide I was referencing in terms of getting us to every single elevation at every single level. This is, at least as far as this report goes, the gospel on DFEs. If you're seeing other things or there's like conflicts or you're getting different information, just reach out over email and we can clarify what's happening for you and figure out, where this kind of disconnect is happening. But for anonymous, whoever you are, if this slide helps, let us know. If it doesn't, please reach out by email.
And apologies to some of the folks in Slido for not getting to all of your questions. A couple of them are things that I don't actually think that Sanjay knows the answer to, like how the recent changes in leadership, presidential and mayoral, will shift the timeline and
No
funding for these
comment.
projects. I think that's a phenomenal question that Sanjay cannot answer.
Someone else should answer that one.
There's also a question about who are the investors and stakeholders so far and what are their priorities. I think you've talked a little bit about, you know, who the different landowners are and what you're doing to work with them. I don't know if you want to have any final thoughts on that.
No, I mean, obviously that's where all this kind of comes together. And as Bud said, that's kind of an ongoing conversation that's maturing in a lot of these places. Currently, we're using kind of FEMA funds, pilot projects, partnerships with the state, things like that. It's a little bit of engagement with private folks to think about some pilot projects that we can do. So like various deployables, you know, applying for grants for larger projects. But it's all, you know, still just coming together when it comes to funding and financing for something that, you know, this project identifies, this is a generational project, right? This is not like filling some potholes. So there's going to be a lot more conversations to be had in this space.
Great. As I noted, the plan is available if you click the link in the chat. You can also see a copy of this video if you'd like, and you can reach out to Sanjay directly for a copy of the slides if that is your preferred thing to look at later. I'm going to turn it back over to Bud to wrap us up.
Thanks very much, Allison. Sanjay, thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. I hope you'll come back, even though we've asked easy questions like figure out who shall pay and who should retreat. But
yeah, thanks for that.
It's a really nice detailed presentation of the plan. I'd like Alice has put, I think, put in the chat the link to the plan itself. You can follow our work at Boston Harbor Now via our regular emails. There's a lot of space on Twitter now that certain individuals can no longer use it. So we are still active on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Check for us there. Stay well, wear your mask, get your shots. See you on the waterfront.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.